Welcome to Relation Tales. Before we begin this intense story, tell me, where are you watching from? Are you from a big city or a small town? Drop your location in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you into a world where love turns to betrayal, loyalty shatters, and revenge is served in the coldest, most brutal way possible. My name is Chris Monroe, and I had it all: a loving wife, a thriving business, and a younger brother I trusted with my life. But one night, I walked into a nightmare I never saw coming. A betrayal so deep, so vile, it threatened to tear my world apart. They thought I would crumble. They thought I would forgive. They thought they had won. But they had no idea who they had just crossed. And by the time they realized, it was already too late. Chris Monroe had always believed in family first. His father, Howard Monroe, had built their construction empire from the ground up, turning Monroe Construction into one of the most respected names in the industry. Chris had dedicated his life to carrying that legacy forward. He worked harder than anyone, made sure every project was flawless, and ensured that the Monroe name remained untouchable. His younger brother, Neil, was different. Neil had always been the charming one, the risk-taker, the golden boy who never had to work too hard. He was in charge of marketing and finance, bringing in investors and keeping their brand in the public eye. Then there was Renee, Chris's wife, the woman he had loved for 10 years. The woman who had stood beside him, laughed with him, built a life with him. But behind closed doors, she had been hiding secrets darker than he ever imagined. Chris never suspected anything at first. Renee and Neil had always gotten along, but that was normal. They were family. Then little things started feeling off. Renee began working late more often, claiming she was helping with marketing strategies. Chris noticed her laughing at Neil's jokes a little too much. He caught them exchanging quick glances, the kind that made his stomach twist. And then came the numbers. Neil's marketing budget had tripled, and when Chris pressed him on it, the excuses never added up. Still, Chris pushed the doubts away. Because the idea that his own wife and his own brother would betray him, it was unthinkable. Chris was supposed to be at an out-of-town meeting that night. But when the deal got postponed, he decided to surprise Renee. Instead, he was the one who got the surprise. As he pulled up to his house, something felt wrong. The lights were dimmed. Neil's car was parked down the street, hidden from view. Chris's hands clenched into fists as he stepped inside. And that was when he heard it. A low laugh. A whisper. A moan. His stomach twisted. His mind screamed at him to turn back. But he didn't. Instead, he walked straight into the bedroom. And there, tangled in the sheets where he and Renee had once made love, were his wife and his brother. For a long moment, no one moved. Renee's face went pale. Neil froze, his smirk vanishing in an instant. Chris didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching, memorizing the moment. The moment when his world shattered. "Chris," Renee stammered, pulling the sheets over herself. "It's not what it looks like." Neil had the audacity to smirk. "Come on, man. Don't be dramatic." Chris's hands clenched into fists. His vision blurred with red-hot rage. Then, slowly, his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Get out." His voice was calm. Too calm. But inside, a storm was brewing. Because Chris Monroe wasn't a man who fell apart. He was a man who built things. And now, he was going to build the perfect revenge. Chris stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. His wife, tangled in sheets with his brother, looked like a deer caught in headlights. Neil, the man who had shared his childhood, his blood, had the nerve to smirk. For a moment, Chris felt like an outsider in his own life. He had built everything: his marriage, his company, his family's name, only to find out it had been a house of lies. Renee scrambled to wrap herself in the sheets, reaching for him. "Chris, please let me explain." He didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't show a single ounce of pain. Instead, he nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "You should explain." Neil let out a nervous laugh. "Look, man, this—" Chris cut him off with a single glare. "I wasn't talking to you." His voice was deadly calm. Neil shut up. Chris turned back to Renee. "Go ahead," he said. "Explain." Renee opened her mouth. Closed it. Her lip trembled. I never meant for this to happen." Chris tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "You never meant for it to happen?" he repeated. So you tripped and landed in my brother's bed? She flinched. Neil, the arrogant bastard, sat up and ran a hand through his hair. Look, Chris, man, we're all adults here. Things happen. You and Renee were drifting apart, and we... Chris laughed. A low, chilling sound. That's funny, he said, because I don't remember drifting apart. I remember a marriage, a home, a company we built together. He took a slow step forward. And now, he let out a sharp breath. Now, I remember something else. Neil's smirk finally disappeared. Chris met his wife's teary gaze, cold and unshaken. I remember exactly who you both are. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. But the war had just begun. Chris didn't break. Not in front of them. Not when he left the house. Not when he got into his car. Not when he drove aimlessly through the city. But the second he pulled into an empty parking lot, he gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He had been a fool. While he was working late, building a future for them, trusting them, they had been laughing behind his back. He wanted to rage, to destroy. But he wouldn't. Chris Monroe didn't react. He planned. And his plan? It would ruin everything they built together. Renee expected Chris to scream, to rage, to demand answers. But the silence was worse. He had just walked away. No threats, no yelling, no anger. That night, she sat in their empty bedroom, scrolling through old photos. Their wedding, their first house, the vacations, the birthdays, the late nights curled up watching movies. It had all felt so perfect. She had destroyed it. And now, for the first time, a sickening thought crept into her mind. What if she had chosen the wrong man? Neil had always been the golden boy, the one who got away with everything. He thought Chris would move on, maybe even forgive him. But the first cracks appeared a week later. Neil walked into a board meeting expecting the usual respect, the admiration. Instead, the room was ice cold. His biggest investors had pulled out overnight. The company accounts? Frozen. His business reputation? Crushed. And at the end of the table, sitting in his usual chair, was Chris. Calm, composed, unstoppable. Neil's stomach dropped. He had no idea what was coming next. Chris had spent years building Monroe Construction, making it a household name. Neil had spent years living off that success. Now, Chris was taking everything back. He had been the true mastermind behind their business, but he had let Neil handle the public image, the marketing, the charm. That was Neil's only value. So, Chris destroyed it. He leaked Neil's financial mismanagement to the press. Fake invoices, bad investments, all the reckless decisions Neil had made in secret. Overnight, Neil Monroe became a pariah. While Neil's career crumbled, Renee watched from the sidelines, realizing too late how deep she was in this mess. She tried calling Chris. No response. She showed up at his office. Security escorted her out. She went to their bank account. Her name was removed. And then, the divorce papers arrived. It wasn't just a divorce. Chris had made sure she got nothing. No house. No assets. No money. Renee had left him for another man. Now, she had nothing left. Neil had always been the charming one, the one people trusted. But trust was a fragile thing. When his biggest investors pulled out, the company's stock plummeted. His accounts? Investigated for fraud. His brand? Tarnished beyond repair. And Chris? Chris bought him out at rock-bottom price. Neil Monroe was now jobless, broke, and humiliated. Renee sat alone in a cheap motel room, staring at her phone. She had nowhere to go. Neil was broke. She was broke. The life she had built on lies and betrayal had collapsed. In desperation, she dialed Chris's number. It rang once, twice. Then, the number you are trying to reach has been disconnected. Tears spilled down her face. Chris had moved on, and she had destroyed the only good thing she ever had. Months later, Chris was attending a black tie event, celebrating his new business empire. He spotted two familiar figures in the crowd. Neil, Renee. Both of them looked wrecked, struggling, shadows of who they once were. For a brief second, Renee's eyes met his. She started to walk toward him, hope flickering in her gaze. But Chris simply turned away. She wasn't worth his time. That night, Renee sent one last message. Chris, I'm sorry. I should have chosen you. She waited, prayed for a response. But it never came. Because Chris Monroe? had already erased her from his life. Chris didn't need to destroy them physically. He destroyed them by living better. Renee and Neil had thought they were winning. Instead, they had destroyed themselves. And Chris? He had built something stronger than ever. Because the best revenge is making sure they can never reach you again. Chris Monroe didn't just move on, he thrived. With his brother Neil out of the company and his cheating ex-wife, Renee, out of his life, he rebuilt Monroe Construction into an empire. But revenge wasn't just about success. It was about making sure that Neil and Renee felt their failure with every breath they took. And he wasn't finished yet. Chris no longer spoke to Neil. He no longer spoke about Renee. To him, they didn't exist. But one day, as he was leaving his office, he saw her. Renee. She stood across the street, looking smaller, weaker, a shadow of the woman she used to be. She didn't approach. She didn't dare. She just watched him like a ghost watching the life she once had. And Chris? He didn't even blink. He walked away without a second glance. Neil was drowning. With his reputation in ruins and his business crushed, he was desperate. He reached out to old connections, hoping someone would help him rebuild. But every door slammed shut. Chris had made sure of that. Every investor, every potential partner, gone. Neil Monroe was a joke in the industry, and no one wanted to be associated with a failure. One evening, Neil met with a potential investor, a wealthy CEO who had promised to fund his comeback. Neil was hopeful, too hopeful. But when he arrived at the restaurant, his blood ran cold. Sitting at the table with the investor was Chris. Chris met his brother's eyes, then smirked. "Sorry, Neil," he said smoothly. "This deal is already taken." The investor shook Neil's hand. "Best of luck, Monroe." And just like that, Neil's last hope crumbled. He stormed out, shaking with rage. Chris had taken everything. With Neil's life in shambles, Renee had no backup plan. She tried dating wealthy men. None of them stayed. She tried moving out of state. She couldn't afford it. She tried reaching out to friends. They had all moved on. And finally, in her lowest moment, she did what she swore she never would. She called Chris. Chris was at home, sipping whiskey on his balcony, when his phone rang. A number he hadn't seen in months. "Renee." He let it ring, and ring, and ring. Then, he blocked the number. She had chosen his brother over him. Now, she wasn't even worth a response. Renee had lost everything. She moved into a tiny, rundown apartment, a far cry from the luxury she once flaunted. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing herself. She had been a wife of a powerful man, and now, she was nobody. And the worst part, Chris didn't even care. While Renee and Neil struggled, Chris was thriving. At a charity gala, he met Madeline Carter, a powerful, elegant woman with a sharp mind and an even sharper ambition. Unlike Renee, she wasn't interested in his money. She had her own. She didn't need him. She wanted him. And for the first time in years, Chris felt alive again. One night, scrolling through social media, Renee saw a picture. Chris, with her, Madeline, smiling, laughing, happy. Tears filled Renee's eyes. It should have been her. But now, she was just an afterthought. And Chris didn't even remember she existed. Neil Monroe had never known true desperation. Not until now. Once, he had been the golden boy, the smooth talker, the charming businessman who could walk into any room and own it. Now, he was a shadow of that man. His expensive suits had been sold to cover debts. His once carefully styled hair was messy. His eyes sunken from sleepless nights spent chasing a dream that had already died. That night, he sat in a rundown casino bar, gripping a nearly empty whiskey glass, watching the world move around him. He had just gambled away his last dollar. Everything was gone. His luxury apartment? Evicted. His savings? Drained. His reputation? Ruined beyond repair. And now he was nobody. The bartender gave him a pitying glance as he set another glass in front of him. Neil's fingers trembled as he reached for it, his mind swirling with bitterness and regret. How had it come to this? He had been on top of the world, living the life Chris built, stealing the woman Chris loved, and smirking while doing it. But he had forgotten one thing. Chris Monroe was not the kind of man you betray and walk away from unscathed. Now, Neil was left with nothing but regret. And Chris was thriving. Renee sat in her cramped, one-bedroom apartment, staring at her phone, her hands shaking. She had nothing left. No money, no security, no future, and most of all, no Chris. For weeks, she had pretended she was fine. She told herself that things would get better, that Neil would bounce back, that she could start over. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had ruined her life. And Chris? Chris was happier than ever. She had seen it online, his booming business, his high-profile connections, and worst of all, his new woman, Madeline Carter. Renee hated her with a bitterness that made her sick. It should have been her standing by Chris's side, her going to fancy events with him, her waking up next to him every morning. But instead, she was rotting in the consequences of her own betrayal. A notification popped up on her phone. A friend had posted pictures from a recent gala. And right there in the center of it all, looking more handsome and successful than ever, was Chris. His arm wrapped around Madeline's waist, his smile effortless. And then she saw it, the engagement ring on Madeline's finger. Her heart stopped. Chris was getting married, and that was when it finally hit her. He had moved on. For real. For good. And she had been left behind. Neil Monroe had lost everything, but there was still one person who could save him. Chris. Or so he thought. With no money left, no job, and no future, Neil finally did the one thing he swore he would never do. He showed up at Chris's office. Security barely let him past the front desk. But Neil wasn't leaving without a conversation. When Chris finally stepped out of the elevator, looking sharp in his custom suit, he barely glanced at his brother. Neil forced a smile. "Chris, come on, man. Let's talk." Chris sighed, as if Neil was an inconvenience. "I have a meeting, Neil." Neil took a step forward, lowering his voice. "Look, I know I screwed up, but we're brothers. We can fix this." Chris's face remained stone cold. "You mean how you fix my marriage? My company? My trust?" His voice was dangerously calm. "You don't have a brother anymore, Neil." The words hit harder than any punch. Chris turned, walking away. And that was the last time Neil Monroe ever saw his brother. Renee had lost her dignity, but she didn't care anymore. She had tried to survive on her own, to rebuild, to pretend she didn't need Chris. But she did. He was the only man who had ever truly loved her, and now that he was slipping away for good, she couldn't let it happen. So, she did something she never thought she would. She went to Chris's wedding. The venue was extravagant, filled with powerful businessmen, celebrities, and people Renee once belonged among. And at the center of it all, standing at the altar, was Chris, waiting for his bride. Madeline Carter, dressed in an elegant white gown, walked toward him, radiant. Renee could barely breathe. She had to stop this. She rushed forward, pushing through the crowd. "Chris!" Gasps filled the room. Chris slowly turned, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the entire world stood still. And then, calmly, he spoke. "Security." Before Renee could say another word, 2 guards grabbed her arms, dragging her out of the wedding. She fought, screamed his name, but Chris never looked back. And that was the moment Renee finally understood. Chris Monroe was gone, and she had lost. Forever. The night of Chris's wedding should have been the final closure, but for Renee, it was only the beginning of her worst nightmare. She sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, clutching her phone, staring at the last photo she had of Chris, the one from their anniversary trip years ago. Back when he still loved her. Back when she still mattered. But now, Chris was married to someone else. Someone better. And she was nothing. Her hands trembled as she typed out a message. "Chris, please. I'm sorry. Just say something." She hit send. Then she waited. 1 minute. 5 minutes. An hour. And then, the realization hit her. He wasn't going to respond. Chris Monroe had finally, completely, erased her from his life. And that was the cruelest punishment of all. While Renee spiraled into regret, Neil had vanished. After being humiliated at Chris's office, he stopped trying. The once famous Neil Monroe, known for his charm and business savvy, had become a ghost. Chris had made sure that no company would ever hire him again. Every job application? Rejected. Every business attempt? Shut down before it even started. Every investor? Warned to stay away. Chris didn't destroy Neil directly. He simply made sure Neil destroyed himself. And one day, Neil packed his bags, took his last bit of cash, and disappeared. No one heard from him again. No one cared to look, because Chris had already won. While Renee and Neil sank into nothingness, Chris Monroe rose higher than ever before. Monroe Construction wasn't just thriving, it had become an empire. His partnership with Madeline Carter led to record-breaking deals, making them one of the most powerful couples in the business world. Their faces were on magazine covers, financial news reports, and elite business conferences. Everywhere Chris went, people respected him, admired him, feared him, and most importantly, no one even remembered Neil and Renee, because they had become irrelevant. Months passed. Renee tried everything to get back on her feet, but Chris had made sure she had no future. Her name was tarnished, her reputation ruined. No good company would hire her. No old friends would return her calls. No one wanted to associate with a woman who had betrayed the most powerful businessman in the industry. Desperate, she tried one final act of manipulation. She went to Chris's mother. Renee knocked on the door of the Monroe family estate, hoping for mercy. Chris's mother, Margaret Monroe, had always been kind to her, treated her like a daughter. Maybe, just maybe, she could convince her to talk to Chris. The door opened. Margaret stood there, elegant and stern as ever. But when she saw Renee, her expression turned to ice. "You have a lot of nerve coming here." Renee's throat tightened. "Please, Mrs. Monroe, I just want to talk to Chris." Margaret cut her off. "My son is happy now," she said sharply, "and that has nothing to do with you." Renee felt the floor beneath her crack. Chris's own mother had shut her out. She was truly, completely alone, and Margaret's final words? They haunted her for the rest of her life. "Chris doesn't even say your name anymore." While Renee's world crumbled, Chris's life flourished. A year into his marriage, Madeline gave birth to their first child, a son. Chris held his baby boy in his arms, smiling wider than he ever had before. This was what happiness truly felt like. His past? Gone. Forgotten. Irrelevant. Broke and desperate, Renee searched for jobs outside her field. She applied as a hotel receptionist, a store clerk, even a waitress. Then, one day, she got a response. A position opened at a small cafe. The pay was low. The hours were long. But she had no choice. And that's when fate delivered the final humiliation. One day, while she was working, she looked up and saw Chris and Madeline walk into the cafe. Chris didn't even recognize her at first. Why would he? He was a billionaire now. He lived in a world far above the one she had fallen into. But then their eyes met. For a split second, she thought she saw pity in his gaze. And then, he turned away, as if she was nothing. Renee had never felt pain like that before, because at that moment, she realized the worst thing of all. Chris Monroe never hated her. He simply stopped caring. One day, a rumor spread through the industry. Neil Monroe had been arrested for fraud. Apparently, he had tried to rebuild his career through illegal deals. It didn't work. He was caught, exposed, jailed. Chris barely reacted. Neil was nothing more than a minor inconvenience he had already erased. Years had passed since Chris had last uttered Neil or Renee's names. They had become nothing more than dust in his past, remnants of a story long forgotten. Monroe Construction had expanded globally, partnering with some of the most powerful firms in the industry. What started as a family company had now become an empire, with Chris at the helm, untouchable and unstoppable. His face appeared on magazine covers, business panels, and Forbes' top 10 most powerful CEOs in the world. At home, his life was just as perfect. Madeline had given birth to their second child, a baby girl, completing their beautiful family. Chris had everything he had ever wanted, and the best part? None of it included Renee or Neil. They had become irrelevant. One morning, as Chris was sipping his coffee in his office, his assistant knocked. "Sir, you might want to see this." She handed him a newspaper, and there, printed in bold letters, was the headline. Neil Monroe arrested for fraud. Chris barely reacted. Apparently, after years of failure and bad decisions, Neil had tried to scam investors in a desperate attempt to get back in the game. He had been caught, charged, and now he was rotting in a prison cell. Chris set the newspaper down and moved on with his day. Neil Monroe had officially ceased to exist in his world. While Neil faced prison, Renee had landed somewhere, just as miserable. She was living in a one-bedroom apartment, surviving on minimum wage, doing everything she once looked down on. The once glamorous woman who lived in luxury had been reduced to struggling for rent money. Her beauty had faded. The stress, the regret, and the heartbreak had aged her in ways she never expected. And the worst part? She had to watch Chris Monroe thrive from a distance. She saw his wedding pictures, his perfect children, his thriving company, and she knew she had destroyed herself. One night, sitting alone in her dingy apartment, Renee did something she swore she would never do. She opened her laptop, searched for Chris Monroe's email, and began typing. "Chris, I know I don't deserve to ask for anything, but I need to say this. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I ruined everything, and I see that now. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. Please, if there's any part of you that still remembers what we had, just say something." Her finger hovered over the send button, and then, with a deep breath, she pressed it. Then, she waited, and waited, and waited. Hours passed. Then, her screen flashed. Delivery failed. The recipient has blocked this email. Renee's hands went numb. Chris had permanently erased her from his life. Fate had a way of being cruel. One day, while Chris was leaving a five-star restaurant, he saw her. Renee. She was standing across the street, wearing cheap clothes, her hair unkempt, her face tired and hollow. Chris barely recognized her. For a moment, their eyes met. For a second, she thought he would say something, that he would acknowledge her, maybe even pity her. But then, Chris turned away. Not out of hatred, out of indifference. And that was the ultimate punishment. A week later, Renee got an interview for a secretary position. It was a small company, nothing like the life she once had, but it was a start. She dressed in her best clothes, walked in with confidence, and sat down with the hiring manager. But as she spoke, she noticed something off. The manager was looking at her resume. Then he frowned. "You used to be Renee Monroe?" he asked. Her stomach twisted. "Yes," she said slowly. The manager sighed and set the resume aside. "I'm sorry, but this position has already been filled." Renee opened her mouth, but she already knew the truth. Chris Monroe had made sure she would never rise again. Chris Monroe's children grew up in a world of power and prestige. The Monroe name meant something. It was wealth, influence, and legacy. And Neil? His last name had become a joke. No one spoke of him. No one remembered him. Because Chris had made sure that the only Monroe that mattered was him. With no job, no friends, and no future, Renee was forced to make one final, humiliating decision. She applied for government assistance, food stamps, welfare. The woman who once lived in penthouse apartments, wore designer clothes, and drank champagne with CEOs, was now a number in the system. She had hit rock bottom. And Chris? Chris was living in a world she could never enter again. Chris sat across from Madeline in a private jet, sipping champagne. It was their 5th anniversary. Madeline smiled at him, her eyes filled with love. "Are you happy?" she asked. Chris looked at her, at the life they had built, at everything he had achieved. Then, with absolute certainty, he answered, "I've never been happier." And for the first time in his life, he meant it. Years later, Chris received one last email. This time, from Neil. It was short. "Chris, I know I can't undo the past, but if there's any way we can talk, I'd be grateful. I just want to make things right." Chris stared at the message. Then, he deleted it without replying. Neil Monroe had already been buried in the past. There was no point in digging up a corpse. Years later, Chris stood at the edge of his private estate, overlooking the empire he built. Everything he had worked for, the success, the legacy, the love of a real woman, was his. And as he sipped his whiskey, staring into the horizon, he felt nothing but peace. Renee? Neil? They had faded into nothing. Because the best revenge is making sure they can never reach you again. And that was his final victory.